All right, so we started off the year with a section called What is History? And we looked at just the definitions of basic terms in historical studies. We then went on to defining and debating America's founding ideals so that you wrote an essay. Those will be graded very soon, well, in fact, tomorrow after all of my video conferences. You guys are pretty much the last class to grade to catch up on grading. Then three, I just had you do some geographic review. The fourth section is the colonial roots of America's founding ideals. Those are relatively short reading selections, so I had you do that. And then finally, Americans Revolt is this next section. This has a little bit more what do you call it? More detail oriented. So I want to make sure that we go over the major details, pretty much to let you know like what I'm going to test you on. All right, and this is what these notes actually represent. So I want to go through these sections and kind of pin down. This is all based on your reading, but we're just going to kind of narrow it down to an essential story. All right, so that's what we're going to do. So first of all, it's broken down into four sections. We have the road to revolution, then declaring independence, fighting for independence, and then finally just looking at just really quickly like who else was involved besides the British and the Americans. So we're going to start with the road to revolution. Now, the French and Indian War, or sometimes called the 7 Years' War, produced a lot of tension between the British and the Americans. These problems basically stem from 1754 to 1763, and it was essentially a worldwide struggle between France and Britain for territory and power in the New World. With Britain's victory, what they did is they established a frontier policy so that colonists could not move past or west of the Appalachians. Now, obviously, this is going to create some friction for colonists that want to move westward. And also, the British spent a lot of money and resources having soldiers there at the frontier. And of course, the colonists felt that they could take care of themselves. All right, so the British built a long chain of forts and sent more troops. And then, of course, rather than help pay for this protection, as Britain requested, the colonists believed that they could defend themselves and mistrusted the British Army's presence during this peacetime. So at the time, citizens in Britain paid heavier taxes than the colonists did, and Parliament thought the colonists should pay, therefore, their fair portion. So then, in 1764, it passed the Sugar Act, which placed custom duties on sugar and any other items that were non-British. So basically, it made the other items too expensive. So colonists were kind of forced to buy British products because of due to the cost. So in 1765, Parliament caused an uproar throughout the colonies when it passed the Stamp Act to further raise revenue, going bankrupt essentially because of the French and Indian War, and it required colonists to buy stamps for every piece of paper they used, and that included playing cards and newspapers. And one of the other issues, as people were furious about this, so that if the quote unquote smugglers who were not using the stamps were doing it illegally, right? They didn't have their documents stamped. If they were to be arrested by the British government there in the colonies, the jury would not find them guilty. And so the British decided we're not even going to have juries, they're just going to go straight to jail. Which, of course, I mean, imagine someone being arrested and going to jail and fined without a jury. So that's a huge issue. With representation, colonists argue that as British citizens they could be directly taxed only by their elected representatives because they were represented in the colonial legislatures instead of Parliament. So they wanted their own form of government because obviously Parliament is across the Atlantic Ocean. So after months of colonial unrest, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, in 1766, and instead it passed a Declaratory Act. Now, this Declaratory Act was pretty much symbolic, and it quote unquote said that King George could, quote, bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. So he's basically saying, yeah, okay, so the Stamp Act is a little harsh, a little expensive. However, I'm just letting you know that I can still do whatever I want. Obviously, this is not going to sit well with the colonists. And then in 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, and that is a set of customs duties on British glass, lead, paints, paper, and tea. So this constant barrage of taxes is driving everybody crazy in the New England area. And so there's all kinds of protests in the cities, all kinds. And so as a response to the civil unrest, the British passed what are called the Intolerable Acts, which was just really just punishment to the Massachusetts colonies for that civil unrest. And of course, this is going to create more and more tension so that it finally culminates in the Boston Massacre, where 5 colonists were killed. All right, and of course, this is treated as a massacre. And then eventually in 1773, the Boston Tea Party happens. 90,000 pounds of tea is thrown into the harbor. So, of course, the British government closes down Boston Harbor. It shuts down the civilian courts and then places Massachusetts under firm British control and, of course, sent more troops to Boston. So, the colonists began to establish militias, which were groups of men, mostly local farmers and laborers, who volunteered to be soldiers during emergencies. In New England, the militias called themselves Minutemen because they claimed that they could be ready to fight in 60 minutes. Not 60 minutes, 60 seconds. Okay. So, what then happens is as this starts to culminate and the tensions begin to escalate, the colonial leaders meet in Philadelphia for these resistant meetings that they call Continental Congresses. And so, this is highly illegal. These are all treasonous traitors risking their lives to basically figure out how they're going to resist their ruling government. So there's lots of heavy stakes here. In 1775, the Second Continental Congress forms the Continental Army officially. So they haven't yet declared independence because they believe that there was still a peaceful solution. So the moderates are still winning in this sense. They're still hoping that, yes, we'll have a backup army, but I think we can still resolve this peacefully. Then when actually fighting breaks out at the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775, it sent a petition due to the heavy losses. The colonists clearly lost. The British won, but it was a heavy price. And so the colonists sent a petition to King George III affirming loyalty to him, asking for help in addressing their grievances, and still saying that, hey, look, we still think we can resolve this peacefully. But once the king heard that Bunker Hill had such heavy losses, he refused to hear the petition. So, things are intensifying. Then, of course, Thomas Paine publishes Common Sense, 47 pages, and it made a very fervent case for independence and pretty much put up the argument that nobody should live under a king because Thomas Paine is essentially what's called an Enlightenment thinker. An Enlightenment thinker, like most of our quote-unquote founding fathers, believed that science and reason should be the governing factors in people's behavior. And studying the natural world could not only improve science and technology, but also improve society and government. There's an influence of John Locke clearly within the Declaration of Independence, In fact, it's pretty much, I think Thomas Jefferson acknowledged that it's, I think, quote unquote, pretty much John Locke. So Thomas Jefferson was given the go to do this draft after King George refused their petition. If you guys haven't seen Hamilton yet, you should see it. It's a lot of fun. I haven't watched all of it. I think I got like 10 minutes left, but it's very good. Okay, now the Declaration of Independence is drafted, and it says that the government should derive their powers from the consent of the governed. People, spelled wrong, awesome, have the right to alter or abolish a government when it becomes destructive of their rights. There's more than that. In fact, your assignment today is going to compare two drafts that Thomas Jefferson and his crew put together, and you're basically going to look at the differences between the two drafts. And I would like you to think, okay, Thomas Jefferson wrote the left-hand side. Why were the things changed on the right-hand side? So that's what your assignment is going to be after these notes right here. So I'll put that together, and that'll be in classroom. And of course, this was approved on July 4th, 1776, and we celebrate that day today. Okay, so now we are fighting for independence. We're looking pretty bad. The Patriots are just not the kind of army that can pretty much defend itself against such a classically trained army like the British. So, in the summer of 1776, it seemed as though Britain might force a quick conclusion to the war. Like this was planned on being over fast. And the Battle of New York City was the first of many American losses in the weeks that actually followed. Late on December 25th, about 4,000 Americans crossed the icy Delaware River to march on Trenton in 1776, where they took a 1,400-man force of Germans by surprise. The mercenaries, or Hessians, surrendered after only a brief fight, and then a week later, the Americans defeated a British force at Princeton, New Jersey. So as the war continued, military leaders on both sides did develop new strategies, and after his losses around New York, Washington avoided large, risky battles and instead chose to fight a defensive war by trying to wear out the British, then soundly defeat them. So he settled on a war of attrition, which is basically to exhaust your enemy. Don't attack them head on. Those wars do actually work quite well, as it did for us in the Revolution. So at the Battle of Saratoga, this was an American victory, and it was a major turning point in the war, pretty much because the Americans had been fighting alone, and so when they defeated Burgoyne, the British general, the French did agree to actually enter the war against Britain and give the Americans their support. And this was crucial to the Revolution's success. In June 1778, they attacked the British at Monmouth, New Jersey, and the battle was an American victory, and the British escaped to New York, and that pretty much was the last major battle in the North. Wherever they went, the British were constantly harassed by American troops that were fighting in a style that later came to be called guerrilla warfare. So the guerrilla basically is just a Spanish word meaning war or like soldier. So the Battle of Yorktown in 1778 lasted about 2 weeks, and right there at that battle, Cornwallis surrenders. And that effectively was the end of the American Revolution, the fighting of the American Revolution. Peace talks began in Paris in 1782, and then in 1783, American and British representatives signed the Treaty of Paris, ending the war, and in this treaty, Britain recognized American independence. Now, of course, that's half the battle. They have to actually put together a country. Okay, so almost finished here. The global context, the other players that were actually in the war, the Native Americans actually did side ultimately with the British. Many of them just, for one, didn't trust the colonists, and they thought that if they sided with the British were on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, so they would pretty much be left alone. However, there's plenty of evidence to show that the British said we would give many of the Indian territories back to Native Americans, but it sounds like it was kind of deceitful, like the treaties were kind of dishonest, especially with some of the money that was changing hands. They didn't really understand the monetary value, so it was kind of underhandedness there. And the British did not actually defend their land interests. Germans were involved, obviously, as I just talked about. The French provided supplies, weapons, troops, and naval support to the Americans. This did ultimately bankrupt the French, causing a huge economic crisis in France. Spain did join the alliance, but it was kind of after the fact. So, with the French being involved in this, what happened was that those soldiers actually bring home stories of American independence, all of the values of equality, brotherhood, fraternity, liberty, all of that stuff goes over to France. Now they're still being run by a monarchy, but then that's ultimately going to be its monarchy's undoing. In the past, the French were pretty much, you lived your life according to your ancestry, right? So whatever your father did, you did. And so the soldiers returned and spread these new ideas. Even Thomas Jefferson advised General Lafayette, who was a French general, as the document was being written. So as the Declaration of Independence was being written, Lafayette was right there. And so as he returns to France, his influence was clear. Okay, so the individual status had long been based on ancestry, old French custom. So the government officials supported the monarchy, whereas much of the rest of the white population, especially planters, actually supported a revolution. All right, and so with that economic crisis, everybody jumps in. In fact, France abolishes slavery in 1794. Okay, so that's pretty much going to be it. So kind of you can take notes on this, but if you are careful in your reading and kind of took notes in your reading, then I would study that. But this is just to kind of support what you've learned, maybe get it to stick in the memory a little better. And that's pretty much it. And I will talk to you sometime in the future.